guys, I'm Ancient Designs and welcome back to my YouTube channel. It's done! It's here! I have finished the bodice for Snow White, oh my goodness! So I've been making a lot of really good progress on Snow White recently. As you probably have seen, my skirt video only came out a little while ago. I think this is the least amount of time I have had between Snow White project pieces ever so far, so pretty proud of that. I managed to get both these out pretty quickly, even though they took a lot of time to do, but I just want to talk about how I made this over here because there's a lot going on, and this is so far the piece of the entire costume, including the petticoat, I spent the most time on. So let's get into how I made everything. So first off, before I ordered any of the fabric, I did finish all of my patterns. As you can see here, they are in rougher shape. They have been through a lot. Certain pieces more than others especially. I went through at least 3 different mock-ups to really get this to the point I wanted it at, because I wanted it to really follow the lines of the original costume from the film, but I did also tweak a few things. The main thing I tweaked was the size of this front panel here, because I knew I'd be doing the smocking technique, which we'll get into a little bit later. And I knew how much fabric it used, so I made it a tiny bit smaller just to be a little smarter with my fabric usage, but it still has the basic same seam shapes, which is really great. That was my goal, and I think I achieved that quite well with my patterns. So the first part I actually made was the lining layer, because I could actually use that as a bit of a fitting, and I'm not using that nice silk yet. The lining layer is where all the boning is, and I used boning products from Farthingale's Corsetry Supplies. I used spiral steel boning and little boning cats, cut them all to length, and put them into the seam allowance. So I sewed all of the seams together very carefully, and I stitched the seam allowances down in order to use them as boning channels, where the boning would then slip in afterwards. I also added a boning channel down the very center so I can get this area nice and controlled and flat, and just control the shape and this little point here as well. So I use a piece of bias tape to also sew that down. Now for the silk layer. The silk is made with some of Silk Baron's Gulfstream colored Silk Dupioni. Would highly recommend, but this color is honestly pretty darn perfect for this costume. So I had to cut out all these pieces the same way I did with the lining pieces, but this time I didn't cut out a center front panel because I knew again that we'd be getting to this. So let's talk about the Honeycomb Smocking. So a little disclaimer, this is not a smocking tutorial. I would need to be a lot more in depth for that. This is just a little overview on how I did it. If you would like to learn more on how to do honeycomb smocking, there are some amazing tutorials out there, including some by cosplayers like Renee Cosplay, which I'll post a link in the description to her tutorial on this exact type of smocking. But for my piece, I had to start with an extremely wide rectangular piece that was a little longer than the total bodice, including this point here, because I knew that it'd be cartridge pleated into this eventually. This takes up a lot of fabric, so I just did a very large piece, knowing very well that almost all of it would likely be used. The first step was to actually add some interfacing to the back and start adding dots, which added as essentially guiding points for the stitching and the pleating later on. My points I made 3/4 of an inch apart from each other, both up and down and left to right. It took a lot of time, but this wasn't even the longest part yet. Up next was basting stitches from point to point to point. For this, I just did some really quick, very even stitches, really controlled, and tried to keep them as even as possible along those dots, because that would make eventually the pleats that I was going for nice and even and finished looking. After that was the fun part. I left these long tails of thread at the very end, and I took them and pulled them all, which makes this lovely cartridge pleated effect. This part is probably the most satisfying because those cartridge pleats end up looking really satisfying and really pretty, and the interfacing plus the natural stiffness of the silk makes it work out really well. This would not work as well if this were a floppier fabric. And then the longest part of the process was this part right here, where I started to manipulate those pleats into the diamond-shaped honeycombs that you end up seeing on the final piece. This took me several evenings, I think 3 evenings of on and off work, of just taking my time, relaxing, and trying to get nice, even diamond shapes. In the end, I had a piece that was just big enough for that widest point of the bodice. Thank gosh. This uses up a lot of fabric, but my gosh is it worth it, because it ends up looking really pretty. And I ended up with a panel piece that I was very proud of. Once the smocking was done, it came to the most nerve-wracking part of the entire project, because I had to cut down these smocking pieces and turn it into that front panel you see on the bodice behind me right now. So to do so, I took my pattern piece and pinned it on top of my beautiful smocking panel. And then I set my sewing machine to a decently tight zigzag stitch and very carefully stitched all around the piece. Gosh, my nerves were fried at this point. But I knew very well that because of the way I was doing this, that the zigzags would end up within the seam allowance, so I wouldn't see them on my final bodice, which I don't, thank gosh. Now, one thing about smocking is it kind of creates an accordion effect where it can open up and get wider and smaller. So I also added an extra piece of cotton piece to the back, same as the lining, to help keep that shape exactly where it's supposed to be. This was just sewn on, and then I finally had my front bodice center front piece ready to go and attach the rest. The rest of the bodice sewed together pretty normally, a lot of curved seams around the bodice with a lot of snipped edges and pressed open seam allowance. You'll also notice that my pieces did have some serging around them, and that's because this fabric does fray a whole lot. I just wanted to make sure the pieces didn't get frayed too much because they need to be pretty exact for this bodice. Next up was adding the piping to the bottom, this lovely little corded effect you see right here. I love making piping by hand, so that's exactly what I did. Essentially, I bought some cording from Fabricland, found a width that I really liked, and then I made myself some bias tape that would be at least minimum the length of this waistline here. And then I made my own piping by essentially putting the cording and folding it into the bias tape and stitching along with my zipper foot. This is honestly really satisfying, and I really do love making my own piping. And then it was time to stitch that very carefully onto the bottom of the good side of my bodice. There was a few tricky areas, namely that front point, but with a little bit of manipulation and a lot of effort, I ended up getting it pretty good, I think. It's not too rounded, it's got a decent point there. I'm really proud of how well I got that plan there because it was honestly kind of stressing me out a bit because I knew I needed to nail this part. And then it was finally time to attach the lining to the good side of the fabric. I did this by essentially hand slip stitching it to the inside, essentially folding up that piece of piping and then folding down and around that lining piece. At this point, the bodice was really starting to take shape. I had everything like semi-attached, and I was feeling really good about the project. The hardest parts were now behind me, and now it was just getting to some of the finishings and such on it. One of those finishings were a closure. So something you might have noticed throughout some of these clips is that there's a little piece of fabric added to my lining, and that's called a modesty panel. A modesty panel is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's a piece of fabric added in to the lining, so it's sewn into the lining, and it just kind of goes across the back so there's not this open gap showing whatever is going on underneath my dress. Even though I know very well I'm gonna have a giant bow covering my back in the end of the costume, I still wanted to add this panel just to give myself a little extra oomph. And I do love a good modesty panel and how consistent it makes the back look. It makes it look really pretty. And you'd probably also notice that I had some really nice lacing going on there. I wanted to have a lace up back so I have a little room for adjustment in case of weight fluctuations. So before getting that piping in there, I added in some channels to put some more boning in. In this case, the boning were flat steel. They were not spiral steel because I don't want them to bend around as much. I want these to be nice and stiff, and that's because I want them to hold and support the grommets. The last time I did grommets for this costume was on the corset, the piece that goes underneath. And that was really difficult because my tools did not punch through that thick fabric. In this case, my grommeting tools actually worked quite well. I got through it much quicker than usual. So I was able to punch holes pretty easily, still with a lot of effort, but a lot easier than last time. Was able to press the little grommet pieces down, again, quite easily, thank goodness. And then just like on the corset, I decided to hand stitch around the edges to really secure them in place, but also make them more aesthetic for the rest of the costume. So they'd be that nice little dark blue that matches the sleeves and other areas of the costume. This is just a little aesthetic choice of mine personally, and I like adding it to most of my costumes that include grommets. Now let's talk about these big boys. These sleeves are basically just very large rectangles. They are box pleated, which is a type of pleating that goes in and out in little 1-inch sections, which you see me marking right here. I very carefully pleated them and then pressed them down to keep all these nice pleats in place because I want them to be kept so they have a nice effect on the final sleeve. And then I stay stitched them down just because I didn't want to lose any of that nice pleat placement. I wanted them to be nice and clean. Now, you'll notice me here, I'm using a piece of twill tape and I'm sewing that down right down the very center of the piece. I'll get to exactly why I do that later, but this is a very important step to how these sleeves work. Then I had to create the seam for this, which is a nice French seam along the underside. You will never see this seam on the final costume because it is just stuck up in there and like under a bunch of pleats and stuff. but a French seam is a great way to finish this off because I did not want this stuff fraying. I ran into a few issues with that because they were starting to fray because I hadn't serged these pieces. If you're using silk gyo peony, I would highly recommend using either a serger or very quickly using your pieces. I had these lying around for quite a while because of the holidays, so don't do that. And then I created a hem. I did not have to finish the edges on the hem because I was actually using the selvage edge because I had flipped it this way. So the selvage edge was at the very, very bottom. I was able to create a wide hem without any other flippage or any serging or anything. And I created a little opening as well. This was because both this hem and that center bit of twill tape were acting as casings for some elastic. So I took my bodkin and I pulled the elastic through, and I had two sections of elastic, essentially creating my two poofs. Right now, this is pinned up and on, but typically this shaping would be controlled by it sitting on my arm, actually in a very similar way to the way my sleeve is now. Tight around here and flops down, and so I can control it and make it more comfortable if need be. This makes it very flexible, more comfortable, and a little easier to construct, and it works really, really quite well. I really like how the effect ended up looking. So once I knew that my little poofs worked out, it was time to just attach it to the bodice. I only attached it to the silk side by machine, and then afterwards would go in, fold in the lining side to cover up all the seam allowance so it looked nice and clean and finished on the inside. It also makes it very, very comfortable. And finally, this was looking like an actual finished piece. There was only one thing left, and that was the lace along the collar. For this lace, I actually used two types of lace. They're both technically the same kind, just one is a bit longer than the other, which is perfect to create the effect of the overlap effect I wanted on this. Now, because of the round nature of my neckline, I knew I was going to have to kind of ease in these pieces, but that was perfectly fine. So I would cut the edges so they look nice and finished, as you can see me doing right here. And then I started to apply them by hand with a simple whip stitch to the very top. I actually really like doing this step. It was very relaxing, and I was playing around a lot with the different ways to overlap, and I'm really happy with the way I finally did it. I originally wanted to try making my own lace, but then when I found this lace trim at Fabricland, I knew that it would work so well, and I absolutely loved it, so I really wanted to put it onto this costume. And next thing you knew, I had a finished bodice piece. This part was done. Oh my gosh. So all in all, this took me the most time out of any piece so far, including more time than the petticoat. Only by 2 hours, but still took more time. Longest part, of course, was the smocking, because that alone took around 12 hours. I'm really, really proud of this piece. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and it took me around 4 weeks of on and off work to make. I'm really proud of this piece, and I'm really happy with how well this whole costume is coming along, and I'm getting really, really excited to finish it. At this point, the big chunks, the big pieces are all finished, which is really exciting. So thank you guys so much for watching and continuing to follow along with me on this cosplay making journey. I'm glad you guys have been enjoying this little series, and I really hope I can get more done on it soon and get to show you guys a final costume soon. I know it's been over a year in the making, quite literally. So thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And check out my social media to see updates as they happen on this costume, because I do post them quite regularly in my stories and highlights if you want to keep up with everything. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. See you guys later.